Hi, this is Susan Engel. Welcome to the module on the United Nations system for INTS201. We're starting with some history, so over this and the next lecture we'll cover some of the history of the ideas about and practices of international cooperation leading up to the formation of the United Nations. Our first material is international relations theory, specifically two of the earliest theories, realism and liberalism. On realism, we start with the ideas of Machiavelli and Hobbes and what they tell us about how states should or do act in their international relations. And that leads us into a quick introduction to one of the first international organisations, the Concert of Europe. I'll examine whether it shows us realism in practice. Then we turn to the idealist or liberal school, starting with the ideas of Kant and Bentham. The idea of international society is actually a relatively recent one. As Europe's city-states emerged slowly from around 1300, firstly with the growth of Italy's city-states, ideas about the system of states emerged with them, and early writers tended to see the international realm, to the extent they even thought there was one, as a realm for competition and for power and security. They took a rather pessimistic view of the capacity for cooperation and the very nature of man. Niccolo Machiavelli was an Italian historian, politician, diplomat and philosopher. Well, he wasn't strictly speaking an Italian, rather he was a Florentine, because the Italian city-state is a much more recent construction. So he was an official in the Republic of Florence and is regarded as a founder of the discipline of political science and international relations, and specifically the realist approach to its study. His most famous work is titled The Prince, and it argued that to secure a state's survival, rulers must follow a different morality than that which applies to individuals. This political morality achieves a virtuous and stable state and justifies a range of actions that might elsewhere be regarded as immoral. This is an idea that continues to inspire statesmen and women, or, depending on your view, continues to be used by them to justify their grabs for power. In this vein, Machiavelli said, "A question arises whether it be better to be loved than feared or feared than loved. It may be answered that one should wish to be both, but because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved." You can download a copy of Machiavelli's most famous work, The Prince, for free from the Gutenberg Library. The link is on our subject website. The other founding father of realist international relations is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was based in England, and he was also motivated by a concern about civil strife. In this case, the strife was between the supporters of the Stuart King Charles I and those of Oliver Cromwell, which produced the English Civil War in 1641-51. He published Leviathan right at the end of this in 1651. So not surprisingly, Hobbes too thinks an absolute government is needed to maintain peace and security, though he doesn't mind if it's a monarchy or not. His argument for sovereignty is derived from one on political obligation. This runs that before states are formed, people live in a state of nature, and during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition called war, and such a war as if of every man against every man. So, to prevent this, we need a social contract between the subjects and sovereign, where, as Richard Devitak has said, essentially the sovereign agrees to protect and the subject agrees to obey. This is the image on the original front cover or frontispiece of the Leviathan, and it really captures many of the book's ideas. At the top is the sovereign, and his place indicates that he is supreme and absolute. Force is represented by the sword in the prince's right hand, and law is represented by the sceptre in his left, and they work together to rule the people, which if you look really closely you can see is what his body is actually made up of. The land and other components of society are indicated in the pictures below. In the image, to quote Richard Devitak again, the state is like a natural human body. When the discipline of international relations was created post-World War II, it turned to thinkers like Machiavelli and Hobbes to frame the questions it would focus on, and hence came the realist school of international relations. It turned to Machiavelli and Hobbes because idealism and realism, which had been popular, had been quite discredited by the outbreak of World War II. The realist school of international relations has three main assumptions or premises, and these are, first, that states are the only important actors in international relations. Second, that states are unitary actors. In other words, their internal relations aren't important in understanding the global balance of power, only their external relations. And indeed, some states are more important than others, and what realists are actually most interested in is the big powers and the influence they have. Third, realism says that international relations is at its core a struggle for power, and that rulers must always be aware of other rulers who are equally trying to grab more power. Your reading for this module is the open access article on theories of international relations, which is available on our website. As I explained in the introduction, the Concert of Europe is quite a good example of a realist way to organise relations between states. It was established by the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which met to restore order in Europe after the defeat of Napoleon. It was an informal organisation that met on an ad hoc basis through conferences called when Europe's stability was threatened. So this was recognition that not just hostility between states, but instability within them could endanger European stability. Instability within them was mostly a concern about revolution and the rise of the masses. The Concert was a deeply conservative organisation whose mission was to restore the pre-Napoleonic status quo and monarchy. As Mark Mazower has said, it prioritised order over equality, stability over justice. Of course, the Concert of Europe couldn't contain the growing power of nationalism and calls for popular sovereignty that only expanded after the US Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789. It couldn't also contain the revolutionary impacts of the Industrial Revolution, which was really impacting on people's lives by the 1830s and 40s. The first step in the Concert's demise was as early as 1818, with the British announcement not to become involved in concert decisions that didn't directly involve them. The Concert unravelled, though, in the second half of the 19th century with successive wars amongst its participants. The Crimean War, the Italian War of Independence, the Austro-Prussian War, and the Franco-Prussian War. There was a successful Congress of Berlin held after these in 1878 to redraw the political map of the Balkans, but an attempted meeting in 1914 to prevent the outbreak of World War I failed, so that's regarded as its formal end date. This was a realist organisation that didn't stop the outbreak of the largest scale conflict that the world had seen. So it's not surprising that there was a turn away of realism toward another key strand of political thought at the time, idealism. This tradition also has a long history, but we're going to start with the work of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant and the British scholar Jeremy Bentham. Kant was an 18th century German philosopher, indeed a founder of modern philosophy. He's a major contributor to the birth of liberal ideas about international relations as well. His contribution to international relations needs to be understood from his premise that humankind was capable of universal reason, rather than being creatures of folklore and myth or the selfish creatures of realist international relations theory. This is an enduring assumption or commitment of liberal international relations theories. In other words, there's a belief that people can and do improve. One of his most influential contributions to international relations was his 1795 essay on perpetual peace, a philosophical sketch. In this essay, Kant considered how we would get to perpetual peace. He posited it would be through the establishment of republican governments, which have an effective separation of powers. For Kant, this separation of powers meant that the common interest in peace would ultimately come to the fore in government. So Kant was a republican, but not as fond of democracy. He thought the separation of powers was more important than representation per se. Though he did say that in relying on citizens for soldiers, not on mercenaries, governments would ultimately promote peace in order to maintain their legitimacy. The point being that republics are still accountable to their populations in some ways. Kant didn't think perpetual peace would happen overnight. Rather, he envisaged a slow emergence of a cosmopolitan order as states improve themselves internally and make perpetual peace by joining an international organisation. So a League of Nations was part of his plan, as was the idea of the necessity of free movement between states. These are the prerequisites of his 6-point plan for peace. We're going to go through the preliminary articles of his plan, the first one being that no peace treaty is valid if it was made with mental reservations that could lead to a future war. The classic example of this idea is the Treaty of Versailles that concluded World War I, but left Germany subjugated financially and otherwise, and is generally understood to be one of the causes of the Second World War. Kant's second point was that no independent states, large or small, should come under the domination of another state by inheritance, exchange, purchase or gift. This is an interesting clause because it doesn't condemn colonialism or imperialism, which was expanding as Kant wrote. It only applied to so-called independent states, which the colonial powers said didn't occur in much of Africa or Asia. Equally, it doesn't outlaw domination by conquest. Still, I think there's a strong suggestion here of the problems of domination over other peoples, whether it's in states or not. Kant's third point was that standing armies should be abolished. Of course, states have retained a strong commitment to standing armies, and they remain the danger to peace that Kant identified. Fourth, Kant said that national debts are not to be incurred as an aid to the conduct of foreign policy. In other words, states shouldn't borrow to fund expansionism or their activities with other states. Fifth, Kant said no state is to interfere by force with the constitutional government of another state. Today we express this idea as non-interference, and it was a founding principle of the United Nations system. It's come under challenge with the idea of responsibility to protect. This is the idea that states have a responsibility to protect their civilians from things like mass atrocities, and where they fail, the international community has a responsibility to act. The validity of this doctrine is still contested, and many states still hold non-interference as absolute. Indeed, it's been a defining principle of the non-aligned movement, which is a key block of developing and emerging states in the UN system. Kant's sixth point was that no state during a war is permitted acts of hostility that would make mutual confidence impossible after the war was over. And the examples he gave were the use of assassins, poisoners, or the incitement to treason in opposing states. Here is the genesis of the idea of rules of war, which predate the UN system with the Hague and Geneva Conventions, but they are responsibilities of the UN today. States constantly break these rules, of course, when it suits their purposes, but nevertheless they act as a standard and a deterrent. The podcast with David Freestone, a little later in this module, explains more about the role of international law. Turning to Jeremy Bentham, he was a British philosopher, jurist and social reformer. He was the founder of modern utilitarianism, which simply put is analysis based on the fundamental axiom that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. Bentham, like Kant, developed a plan for universal and perpetual peace. But in contrast to Kant, who was sceptical of law, Bentham's plan was based on the idea of codified international law, based in turn on utility maximisation. The reason this focus on law is important for us is that it persisted and grew over the 19th and 20th centuries and became a prominent focus of the UN system. One last point on Bentham is that he actually coined the term international, which is a useful reminder of how recent the idea of a global system built around sovereign states is. It wasn't until this idea became more common that the idea of inter-nation relations became significant. Kant and Bentham were two of the key inspirations of the idealist and liberal schools of international relations theory. And there's more on liberalism in the Theories of International Relations article on our website. But one of the key things to remember about liberalism in particular is that it's a broad church. There are many strands of liberalism, though the two main strands of it are one which focuses on human rights and freedoms, and another which has come to prominence in recent decades, focusing on market freedoms. Both strands contributed in their early years to the idea of international cooperation, which is clear for the strand focus on human freedoms, but perhaps not so obvious for the strand that focuses on market freedoms. Some of the early promoters of market freedoms saw that these freedoms would allow free intercourse between men, which would promote prosperity and harmony. These early economic liberals were promoters of democracy too. It was quite a radical position at the time, because it opposed the rights of power and wealth of the aristocracy and landed gentry based on inheritance, not performance. Both strands suggest too that humanity is at heart peace-loving, in contrast to realism's very pessimistic view of man's nature. So to conclude, realism and liberalism are two of the oldest theories of international relations, and they remain quite influential. Their relative influence has been tied up with perceptions of their successes and failures. So realism was discredited by the outbreak of World War I, and idealism was discredited by the outbreak of World War II. But both beliefs have strongly influenced institution building in international relations. We'll continue to look at their influences on institution building in the next clip, as well as examine a little bit about the League of Nations, the United Nations direct precursor.